Hi there, and good morning. Thanks very much indeed for the invitation and for the very kind words in the introduction. On the subject of language skills, I fear that my more than a year learning modern Turkish means I'm barely qualified to communicate with a 6-year-old, but I'm doing my best. And on that subject, I probably ought to thank and express my admiration for scholars like Alexander Mikaberidze or Roger Davies or Virginia Askin for the work they do in terms of translating both Russian and Ottoman Turkish as primary sources, which without which I would struggle to write a book like this, which is very much aimed at the general reader. I hope my books generally encourage people to look at conflicts and parts of the world that certainly to Western European eyes are rarely seen. So what I'm going to do this morning is sort of introduce the conflicts and the subjects covered in this book. Hopefully to give people an insight into an area of the world which is sadly suddenly become rather topical. It wasn't my initial intention. So let's start with a bit of introduction and look at the map that you can see on the screen. This will obviously be fairly familiar map to people in Western Europe and worldwide since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But essentially, this is a seat of war during this period, although it did extend into the Caucasus to the right and to the Balkans on the left. In fact, even as I will touch upon, down into the Mediterranean and the Levant. There were two major wars during this period, 1768 to 74 and 87 to 92. And I deliberately wrote about both of these wars because I think they're linked. They are essentially Catherine the Great's wars of expansion, expanding the Russian colonial empire in down to the south to the Black Sea, which was a key war aim of the Russian Empire during this period. So what we've seen overall is a further decline in the Ottoman Empire in the period and the rise of Russia as a major state. So what about the contents of the book? Well, that's there on the right. Essentially, I give some context, not too much. I'm not a big fan of books that spend a lot of time telling you what you probably already know, which is what was happening in the 18th century, but also covering the two empires. And this is where I think it's important as military historians, we like to focus on armies and battles, but we need to understand the social and economic context which enabled the armies and the navies to fight during the period. So I do describe how the Russian and Ottoman empires were organized, how their economies were like, how they were taxed, and how the administration worked, which got the armies to the front lines. Then I deal with the much more detail in the armies themselves, both the Russian and the Ottoman army, before getting on to the wars and the interregnum between the two, which was far from peaceful in between the two periods, and then make some conclusion. I am a war gamer, a very active one, and I hope my books inspire war gamers to look at conflicts which are not often seen on tabletops around the world. So there's some scenarios and how you might do it, and there'll be more on the website. As I said, it's very much aimed at the general reader, but if you want more details and extensive bibliography of both primary and secondary sources that I used in the book. So let's look at the Russian Empire. Very much in the 18th century, the foundations were created by Peter the Great. And I go through very briefly the developments through various czars until we get to Catherine II, the Great, as she was subsequently known. She was the autocrat, and the Russian system was very much a personal autocracy of the Tsar. But it doesn't mean that the Tsar was entirely omnipotent. There's an interesting quote from one of her aides who asked her about this obedience to her orders, and she said, "It is not as easy as you think. I take advice. I consult the enlightened part of my people, and in this way I found out what sort of effects my laws will have. And when I am already convinced in advance of good approval, I then issue my orders and have the pleasure of observing what you call blind obedience." So, yes, it was an autocracy, but there was a system by which she brought people along with her. She was a lucky monarch. Her opponents, particularly in Western Europe, were divided. The Russians and the Prussians, obviously, on her border. Obviously, they were still having conflicts with Sweden and issues in Poland. But it did enable her to focus on the steppe and the southern expansion of her empire, moving the defense lines further south with every conflict and every colonial move. Also, the Cossacks were very often the sort of cutting edge, the borderland fighters, but they were increasingly being integrated into the Russian system during this period. The army itself had some experience of fighting this area in the war in 1735, and they learned a lot about the challenges of supplying armies over vast territories. I think the Russian army in 1735 had something like 40,000 carts behind it, so you can imagine the difficulties that brought in itself. And the 7 Years' War gave it some additional experience, albeit against traditional or cutting-edge Western armies, particularly the Prussians. But the ordinances, or the system, the regulations, if you like, of the Russian army were set out by Romantiev in 1763. I suppose there's a lot in there, but the thing I'd pick out was that the Russians traditionally had fought the Ottomans and their other tribal enemies, the Tartars and others on the steppe, by creating huge divisional or even army squares, and those armies fought in that way for many years. And Romantiev started to introduce a more flexible square model. Those who are familiar with ancient history will think it looks very much like the Republican Roman system, and that's probably, given the classical education that 18th century nobles got, was probably where they got the idea from. But they did have cavalry. They had cuirasses, although they were becoming more lighter armed during this period in the steppe in particular. Less so in Western Europe, where cavalry was probably getting heavier. They had carabineers, which essentially was the name for dragoons during this period. Again, they learned from the 7 Years' War the need to have slightly heavier horses than they had before. So these were heavier cavalry than the traditional Russian dragoons. And light cavalry was provided by the Cossacks and some other tribal forces. The Russians didn't have it all their own way. Troops were generally conscripted into the army from the serfs. Essentially, a number didn't always produce the best recruits. Very often, landowners popped off some of their less able serfs into the army. Romantiev commented on this in one note. He said, "I was shocked by the pitiable sight and deplorable waste of recruits who straggled through to his army on the Turkish theatre, only to die from the first fatigues of military duty. Self-mutilation, hiding, and escaping were common means of avoiding conscription." So the Russian army did have its problems. It expanded very rapidly, but whilst many of the troops were very hardy and very stolid troops, nonetheless, they did have a huge amount of wastage, essentially. So, as I said, desertion. They also had limited officer training. There were military schools. Again, Peter the Great laid a useful foundation there, but not everybody was trained to the standard of an officer corps in other countries. But what they did have, and I'll return to this later in my conclusions, they did have some outstanding military commanders, which certainly gave them an edge against the Ottomans. So what about the Ottoman Empire during this period? Well, the map shows you how extensive it was, that from North Africa to the Middle East, Arabia, the Balkans, of course, and Anatolia and the Caucasus. During this period, there was a gradual decline. There was a gradual decline in central authority. The Ottomans also suffered from military conservatism. By that I mean there were essentially two competing schools of thought in the Ottoman hierarchy. Those who were reformers, who wanted to change the military into something more akin to a Western European army, and those who wanted to keep the traditional model. The traditionalists were helped by the fact that A, they won the 1736 war against Austria, but also because it was a long period of peace, and periods of peace are rarely times when military innovation takes place. The Ottomans also had a very weak economy, but they were not the sick man of Europe that they would become in the 18th century. The army itself, the core of the infantry, was still the Janissaries, but they were losing, excuse me, were losing their military character. They essentially didn't recruit using the scheme anymore, and they allowed trades to develop. The sons of Janissaries came into the corps, and during peacetime, they would be traders and artisans. The largest number of troops were recruited during what was called the Levend. These were locally recruited troops or contracted troops. So a contractor would go out and find 5,000 troops and bring them to the front and would be paid. The empire would attempt to improve the equipment of many of these troops, which was poor, and they were a very mixed bag. Some that came from some of the local warlords were quite good quality troops, others less so. For the cavalry, you still had the household cavalry, the Capiculu, who were still not huge numbers in this period, but still decent heavy cavalry. However, the Spahi, the traditional semi-feudal Ottoman cavalry, they were in decline during this period. There's no doubt they were less heavily armed, less well equipped, largely because the Timar system, which essentially funded them, was in decline, being replaced by tax farms. They still had light cavalry, not the Akinji of old, but the Delhi were still there, means wild man, or some say madman, but there were still competent light cavalry, others less so. And the Ottomans have started to rely fairly heavily on the Tatars from the Crimea and parts of the Balkans, who were essentially the big light cavalry screen of the field army, or operating on their own, as we will see. The one area that the Ottomans did reform was the artillery, using mostly French advisors. So they did have some modern artillery. They also used French engineering officers to upgrade fortresses. And the whole engineering corps was undoubtedly improved during this period. In fact, overseas observers were much impressed by Ottoman engineering. The Austrian Field Marshal Loudon said, "It is beyond all human powers of comprehension to grasp how strongly these places are built, and just how obstinately the Turks defend them." So even to Westernize, the Turks did a good job in relation to engineering. When it comes to commanders, they weren't as lucky as the Russians. There were 3 sultans during this period that obviously had the overall control. At least 2 of those were reformers, but again held back by the military conservatism that I've talked about. The field commanders, the grand viziers, were a strange mixture of prime minister and military leader. Arguably were sort of fell between both of those stools, but you can tell the fact there were 21 of them during this period was a good indication that none of them lasted very long, and there were very few, or I do in the book highlight at least 3 of those, which I would argue were good commanders and good organisers and administrators of the military. So on to the conflict itself. So the war kicked off in 1768, but the real fighting started in 69. The war came about, the casus belli, if you like, was the result of the War of the Bar Confederation, which is a very obscure Polish conflict that few in the Western Europe will have heard of even. Essentially, it was a noble revolt. Russia viewed Poland as part of its sphere of influence, and not everyone in Poland thought this was a good idea, as is still the case today. And so therefore there was this revolt, and the revolt spilt over into the Ottoman Empire with Russian troops in hot pursuit of rebels, and that was the cause, essentially, of the spark, really, for the war, which had been coming for some time. Neither army actually was terribly well prepared for the conflict, which is why it took a while to get into place. And the Ottomans started in traditional fashion by sending the Tartars on a large-scale raid of what is today Ukraine, and the numbers vary enormously and probably fairly unreliable, but certainly 60 to 80,000 horsemen. And if you read the memoirs of people like the French Baron Tot, he describes what that looked like, coming across the steppe, and it must have been quite an impressive sight. Sadly, in military terms, not quite so impressive. The Tatars were not what they once were. These were not the Mongol horsemen of old, but nonetheless, they did this huge raid. Didn't have much military impact. They certainly took a lot of slaves and captured a lot of cattle, but didn't do much else. The war proper kicked off in the Khotin campaign. Khotin is in modern Ukraine. It's up on the border with Romania, up in the north. The castle actually is still there today and has been renovated. It's definitely worth a view when it's once possible to visit Ukraine more easily. But there were 3 battles essentially over a long period. Golitsyn, who was the Russian commander, advanced, had supply problems, went back, advanced again, largely won the military clashes, but really couldn't sustain the siege of the town and the fortress. By the 3rd battle, Catherine had lost patience and actually replaced him with Romantsev, but Romantsev hadn't arrived, so Golitsyn fought the 3rd battle and won it, and the Ottomans had to withdraw. They were initially commanded by Hussein Pasha, about 60,000 men, not all in the town itself, spread among other fortresses nearby, and there were about 80,000 Tatars in the vicinity, but again played no major role in the conflict. Then the war moved into Moldavia, which is a mixture of modern Moldova and the eastern parts of modern Romania. Again, this is Romantsev's campaign. There were 2 major battles, one at Larga, which was mostly against the Tartars. That's in southern modern Moldova, near the Prut River. And the biggest battle, in fact, the biggest battle of the 18th century, again, virtually unheard of in the West, was fought at Kagul on the 31st of July. Numbers again contested, but up to 150,000 Ottomans and about 25,000 Russians. There's a Russian map on the slide here, which makes it look as if it's a very rugged, hilly terrain. I visited it earlier this year, and I would describe it as rolling hills. But again, very little mark. There is a monument on the battlefield and a very small museum in the nearby village. 2 very nice ladies running this museum, a little bemused to see a British tourist. But nonetheless, there is some ways. There are things to see and mark, but it's certainly a rolling hilly terrain. The second army, the Russian second army, went down the Dniester River to try and capture, down to the Danube to capture the major Ottoman fortresses, Bender, which is in modern Transnistria, again another reconstructed or repaired fortress, well worth a visit. Ismail, which is in modern Ukraine on the Danube Delta, and Akerman right down at the coast of Isbralia in modern Romania. So all these fortresses fell relatively easily, and it meant that the whole of the territory north of the Danube was in Russian hands by the end of what they called, very reasonably, the year of victories. So that meant that for the rest of the war, the Danube front was really a battle around north and south of the Danube. So in 1771, the Ottomans had a couple of fortresses still north of the Danube, which they used as a base for raids. And they kept the field army in Bulgaria and modern Bulgaria and the Dobruja area of modern Romania in reserve. But they fed troops in, they raided Wallachia and further afield, and the Russians had to respond to that. In 1772, there wasn't a great deal of action. Peace talks went on, but they failed, and the Russians were distracted by conflicts against Sweden and more trouble in Poland. They also had a major Cossack and tribal rebellion called the Puchikev Rebellion, which took them a long time to put down. In 1773, Catherine was shoving Romantsev to attack into Bulgaria, which he was reluctant to do for supply, and he didn't have enough troops. And therefore, he did some efforts at doing that. So they did attack the outposts. It was really a war of outposts, would be the best way of describing it, with no breakout into deeper into what's modern day Romania and Bulgaria. So in 1774, Catherine shoved him a bit harder, and they did take an offensive. And that resulted, there was a lot of attacks, which I described in the book, but essentially ended up at the Battle of Kozluzhda, which is modern day Bulgaria. In fact, it's called Suvorov, which will tell you all you need to know about the battle, which was that the main Russian commander was General Suvorov. Again, one became more famous in later conflicts, probably one of the finest Russian generals of his generation. That was the 20th of June, and that essentially meant that the Ottomans had a very weak field army and sued for peace. Now, while all this was going on, the Russians had another crack at the Crimea, and an army under the Commander General Dolgorukov. Apologies, my poor Russian there. He took an army across the gap into the Perekop defences, and also across some of the wetlands to get into Crimea. He had learned the lessons on supply, so he was much better organised than previous Russian armies. And of course, a lot of the Tatars were not in the Crimea to oppose it, so it was an easier invasion. And he managed to essentially take out most of the Crimea, including key fortresses in places like Kaffa. Now, the war was not just fought in the Balkans, it was also fought in the Caucasus. The Russians had expanded their colonial empire into the Caucasus as early as 1556, when they reached Astrakhan on the tip of the Caspian Sea there. By 1769, they pushed south to the Terek line, we see on the map, the Terek Cossacks there holding the frontier. And they started with a campaign led by a general called Totleben. So it was a Russian army with Georgian allies. However, they failed to capture the key harbour port of Poti. Again, that's on the Black Sea side, or the Sea of Azov side of the Caucasus. And Totleben fell out with his allies. He tried to dabble in Georgian politics, which is always a dangerous concept for the Russians, not stopping them today, but still that was the issue then. And so they fell out and really didn't achieve very much militarily. The 74 treaty confirmed the Mozdok line, which was not much further south than the Terek line, and the Georgians continued to fight the Ottomans during that period. In 1783, Catherine the Great, this is after the war, so she confirmed Georgia as a Russian protectorate. But the Russians had their own problems in the area. In 1785, they had the Imam Mansur rebellion. This is in North Caucasus, areas like Chechnya, Dagestan, areas where the Russians have since traditionally had problems, very mountainous terrain, and had huge problems in putting down that particular rebellion. When the war kicked off again in 87, obviously the Ottomans built on the Mansur rebellion. The Russians attempted both to put it down and to capture the key Ottoman port of Anapa, just off the map on the left-hand side there. They had three campaigns over 3 years and eventually captured it in 1791, but there were no territorial changes in the treaty. Then we have the war in the Mediterranean, rather oddly, you might think. The Russians had no great maritime tradition. There very few. They had a river fleet on down the Black Sea, which they started to create in Peter the Great's time and built on it slightly. Obviously Peter the Great did create a Russian navy, but this was on the Baltic. The Ottomans had modernized, or at least started to modernize their navy. They had modern ships of the line and frigates, but still had a large galley fleet, as did the Russians as well. So, galleys were still a feature of naval warfare during this period. So what the Russians did was, because you couldn't sail from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, because obviously the Ottomans controlled the straits at Constantinople. So they sent their Baltic fleet in 3 squadrons, including 2 Scottish admirals, into the Mediterranean. So they sailed it through the North Sea, down the Bay of Biscay around. Now, they could not have done that without extensive British help. So the Royal Navy helped them resupply, repair their ships, which really struggled. The quotes from the Royal Navy officers at the time were not much impressed with the Russian fleet. But nonetheless, eventually they got a substantial number of ships to the Mediterranean and to the Aegean. And the Orlov brothers, who were the brains and the commanders behind this expedition, the Orlov brothers had been fomenting revolt in Greece in particular for many years before this war broke out. And so when they got there, they could land troops, Marines and infantry, to not a lot, but some, to assist Greek revolts. The problem was that a lot of Greeks didn't revolt. There was limited support, really. It looks impressive when you see it on the map with all those arrows and stars for centres, but a lot of these were not huge revolts and not always supported by the population, many of whom still supported the Ottomans. So it didn't go very far, and the Ottomans managed to put down all those revolts. But the Russians were more successful at sea. They had a number of clashes with the Ottoman fleet, and that resulted in probably the most famous battle of the period, and the one I used on the cover of my book, which is the Battle of Chesma in July 1770. Essentially, the Ottomans, the Bay of Chesma, they created a line of battleships, or several lines of their ships, and the Russians broke it largely using fire ships. And the key breakthrough with fire ships was led by another Scottish sailor called Samuel Gregg, who went on to be an admiral in the Russian fleet. So for the rest of the war, the Russians essentially raided the Anatolian coast, captured a few Aegean islands, but didn't do very much. They had huge supply challenges, as you would imagine, trying to supply their fleet from Russia, all that distance away. There was a revolt in the Levant because some of the Ottoman governors decided to have a go on their own during the period. And the Egyptian governor went into the Middle East and Levant itself. That went to and fro, and the Russians sort of supported that revolt by landing, or sending ships certainly to Beirut and landing some troops on both occasions. But it's a side show, but nonetheless quite an interesting one. So when the war ended with the Treaty of Kujakanaka in 1774, the Russians gained proper Black Sea ports, and the Crimea was to be independent, but really under Russian direction. There was a very controversial and unclear clause that gave the Russians the right to protect Christians in the Ottoman Empire, much contested by the Ottomans. Depends on which language and the wording of the treaty, but it would create problems not just immediately, but in the future. The Russians indicated quite extensive reforms after the war. They tended to integrate the Cossacks more, partly as a result of the Prussia Rebellion, but also to bring them more into the system, both administrative and military, and created in New Russia, brought more ethnic Russian colonists into the area, and economically developed the area. The Ottomans did very limited reforms. The new Sultan Abdul Hamid tried to make some changes, but again, military conservatism largely won. They did manage to thin out the Janissary corps a bit, but didn't make the sort of changes that they needed to do. This was a period also of Catherine the Great's infamous Greek project, which he had a vision of essentially ejecting the Ottomans from the Balkans and creating at least two new states, one ruled by her son and one ruled by Prince Potemkin, her probable husband, certainly her lover. And the idea was to pin the Ottomans back into Anatolia. So scholars argue about whether this was a driving force of Russian policy as distinct from a grand vision of Catherine's. But I think the modern evidence is that it was a driver of policy, and she had her and certainly Prince Potemkin both felt very strongly about this, supported by other Russian officials. An interesting side thing, but for obviously I'm doing this talk and I live in Scotland in the United Kingdom. Britain's role is quite interesting, and I do put a section in there, and some interesting work probably in the British archives on Britain's shifting role. Traditionally a trading partner, at least with the Russian Empire, not so much militarily, was helping them in the First War. By the Second War, were almost regarded as an enemy, but there were some quite interesting issues like trying to recruit British convicts, for example, to help colonize parts of the southern Russia, because this was the same time as the American War of Independence, which obviously limited French and British were preoccupied elsewhere. What Catherine also did in this period was eventually just annex the Crimea. So that became, and that was probably the casus belli of the next conflict, although you can see a whole range of things was linked to that. There were various sort of Russian provocations in the Balkans as well. So the war resumes in 1787. Here, the Russians had the Austrians as allies. So Potemkin, who was essentially became very quickly Romantiev, was there at the start of the war, but he became ill and actually semi-retired. So Prince Potemkin was the overall commander. He had about 145,000 Russian and Allied troops. The Ottomans were led by one of the better Grand Viziers of the period, Kaka Yusuf Pasha, who had about 200,000 men. But of course, he had to defend on the Austrian front in Bosnia and modern northwest Romania, as well as deal with the Russians in Moldavia and elsewhere. The first big battle of the war was at Kinburn, which is Kinburn Spit, which is modern Ukraine. It's a spit of land that is important for controlling the estuary that led up to Kherson. So the Ottomans tried to land, and Suvorov, who was the commander at Kinburn, managed to fight them off. The other side of the estuary was the huge fortress of Ochakov, the key Ottoman defense of the area, and there was a long siege there in 1788, and naval actions all around it. Again, with foreign commanders, the Russians brought in foreign admirals, of which, for our American audience, included one John Paul Jones, of course, was another Scot, but probably more famous for his role fighting for the Americans in the War of Independence or Revolution. Anyway, he commanded one of the flotillas, kept falling out with Potemkin, and so wasn't entirely successful, but it's an interesting side thing. The Russian Black Sea Fleet was pretty successful overall in a series of actions which I cover in the book, managing to defeat, or at least to disperse, the Ottoman Navy, which was being partly rebuilt and mostly focused on the Black Sea during this war. So after Ochakov fell, essentially the Russians took the war again into Moldavia. This time in 1789 with two major battles. The war this time has shifted into what is modern Romania, the Moldavia area of modern Romania, and two battles. Foscani and Rymnik, again not well marked in modern Romania, certainly not Foscani. Rymnik, you would know there's a battle if you drive down the main road through the battlefield. You'll see a huge statue of Suvorov overlooking it, and you can do it, although it is quite difficult to follow the battlefield because the rivers are not what they once were, climate change and water use, and obviously the forests have been chopped down, so it's quite a difficult battle to follow because a lot of them were very big battles. In fact, Rymnik was the largest battle in the 18th century, and it was fought over quite a territory and moved in various different stages. So it's quite an interesting battle, but quite confusing one to follow. Then that meant that the Russians could again move down to the Danube. So we were back to, this time, a tougher siege of Ismail. The Ottomans had improved the defences with some help of some French engineers. And there was a siege in December 1790, which wasn't going very far until Suvorov arrived, and in his usual very much more aggressive mode, organised the storming. The most successful part of that storming was led by one Kutuzov, who again will be more familiar to Westerners from his command in the Napoleonic Wars. But this is the campaign that he essentially cut his teeth and did some very innovative work about light infantry training with the Jaegers and military intelligence as well. Another interesting sideline in this period. Anyway, he was given command of Machin of Ismail after they captured it, and launched some attacks on the Ottoman field army, which is based in what's today modern Dobruja area, a place called Baghdad. And that led to a battle at Machin, which was an Ottoman fortress south of the river Danube, not far from the Romanian city of Braila. And again, it was Kutuzov who managed to march his troops around the flank and attack the weaker Ottoman flank and won that battle. That really ended the war. The Austrians had already signed a peace deal, so the Russians had lost their major ally, and a treaty was signed at the Treaty of Iași, which is in modern northern Romania, in 1792, which confirmed the Russian annexation of Crimea, gave them some land gains on their western border, but not a huge amount of that actually changed. Princess Potemkin died during those negotiations, probably appropriately on the steppe that he spent so much of his time colonizing, and Catherine the Great died sometime afterwards. So I think that's an appropriate reason I ended the war, the book, then at this period, rather than carry on into the Russo-Ottoman Wars of the later period. So, in conclusion, we should never forget, I think, when describing some of these huge wars and huge conflicts, that there were nearly 1 million military casualties during these wars, which, by 18th century standards was huge. And of course, we've no idea how many civilians lost life, but clearly there was major reasons there: war, famine, plague, and so on. So there was economic devastation in the region, particularly in the Balkans. Russia won both wars. They may not have made huge gains as a result, but they certainly won both wars, thanks largely to outstanding commanders. And I picture those four. I do think, I'm not a great fan of the great men of history, but I do think these outstanding commanders were a major reason for them winning these wars over the Ottomans. Romanciev at the top left there is not well known, but actually Suvorov, who was the next one there, is better known for his later conflicts, but he said that I am a pupil of Romanciev. So he learned his trade on the back of that great reformer. Down there at the bottom on the left, you've got Kutuzov, not a very early and young picture of him, with both eyes. He got wounded during these conflicts, and in fact the siege of Ochakov was where he got his first of several wounds, and was lucky actually to survive. And Prince Potemkin, Catherine's probable husband, a man who liked a uniform, a larger-than-life character, beautifully described. I'd recommend Simon Sebag Montefiore's brilliant biography of him if you want to know more. For the Ottomans, their failure to reform penalised them in both wars. They had inadequate border defences. They did have some decent fortresses, but nothing much in between. They didn't create what the Russians did, which was to use their military to embed their colonial outposts. And their economy suffered from war, famine, plague, and debatably maybe decentralisation. Though some scholars argue there was a better way of running the Ottoman Empire than the traditional centralised control. But the Ottoman Empire didn't collapse. They lost some territory, but not all of it by any means. They did reform later, probably very slowly, certainly not quickly enough. But essentially, you could say the Ottoman Empire was on the defensive from then until its collapse, obviously after the First World War. But from a Russian point of view, there was no new Byzantine Empire. Catherine's Greek project did not come to fruition. The Ottomans controlled the Balkans until the Balkan Wars of 1912-13. But these wars did lead to unfinished business, essentially, other wars there. So I'll stop there. Obviously, other than the sales pitch that you can buy the book, I always encourage people to buy from the local bookshop because we should have more of them. You can buy them, obviously, particularly for overseas purchase. From my point of view, that if you're in the United States or anywhere in the world, essentially you can get the book as either a paperback or a Kindle version through Amazon, or obviously you can get it directly from the website, and there's the address. Essentially, it's balkanhistory.org, and you can access both this and most of my other books as well. So I hope that was helpful. I was interested. I hope it introduces something that a lot of audiences will not be familiar with. There are some studies on bits of this period, but probably no one's. This is the first book for the general reader that hopefully opens up the whole period and is of interest. I think it was fascinating. I enjoyed researching it. My thanks to those who accommodated me on my various trips around the battlefields and the museums in particular. Particular thank, obviously, to the archives I visited and to the major libraries I rely on, British Library, National Library of Scotland, and my friends in those countries who were enormously helpful as always, in taking me around places, introducing me to people, and particularly I'd like to lastly thank the scholars, as I said earlier, have done so much work in this period and made it a lot easier for myself to do this work. So thanks very much, and I'll happily take questions.